Good afternoon and welcome as we continue our lecture series in celebration of the 50 years of Black Studies here at Duke University. And it's an honor and pleasure today to introduce one of our folks who are coming home, Professor Candis Watts Smith. So I'll start with a small story about Candis Watts Smith. In the summer of 2006, my wife and my then very, very young daughters moved into, hell, what's the name of the dorm?
Giles.
We moved into Giles dorm on East Campus. And of course, all of that, and we're part of the faculty and residence program, which if you're faculty and you haven't done it, I encourage you to spend 2 or 3 years of your life with undergraduate students in a close, intimate basis. But one of the joys of the experience is that we didn't actually have to be that intimate with the students because there was a graduate assistant that was in charge of that work, and that was Candis Watts Smith. So in some ways, even though I didn't know her as an undergraduate at Duke, I got to know her as a graduate student. And so it's kind of amazing to see where she is now, 14 years later, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. The author of several books, Black Mosaic, The Politics of Black Pan-Ethnic Identity, published by New York University Press 2014. The co-author with Tahama Lopez Bunyanzi of Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter, NYU Press 2019. And the just published Racial Stasis, The Millennial Generation and the Stagnation of Racial Attitudes in American Politics, University of Chicago Press, 2020. She will be joined.
Wait a minute, there's another book, because there's a series that I have. Don't leave that one out.
Yeah, you've been busy. She will be joined in conversation this afternoon with my good friend and colleague, who was on her dissertation committee.
I chaired it.
Professor Kerry Haynie, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies here at Duke University, also the chair of Duke's Academic Council, which is the leading governance body of Duke University. So welcome, and looking forward to a great conversation.
So I'll just start with a few remarks. One, thank you, Mark, and also let me say it is the 50th anniversary of the AAAS department, and so I want to say and just to say the names of folks who I learned from, who taught me, Maurice Wallace, Mark, who he's saying that in jest, but I end up becoming a faculty in residence at another place because of people like Mark. John Jackson was also in that program. Juanima Luliano, Carla Holloway, Sandy Darity, I all got to learn from in my 9 years at Duke.
She was an undergraduate first.
Yes.
It wasn't.
It was. Of course, Paula McLean, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, the very larger than life characters, and then Kerry. So Kerry, I accidentally went to office hours, and I didn't know what office hours were. So I needed to drop off this paper, and he was like, "Sit down. I need to let's talk." And because he talks like that. And he encouraged me to apply to the Ralph Bunche Institute. And I did. And now I'm a political scientist. And then he chaired, as you said, my award-winning dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
And he just has been a mentor to me all of these years. So thank you, Kerry.
Thank you.
And to all of those people that I named, and it takes a village. So happy anniversary to AAAS. I want to start off with just a little piece of research that I've done, just to kind of give you a taste of what I've been up to, and just hopefully to kind of launch our conversation with Kerry and with you all. I want to hear from you all. In the past couple of years, I've really been thinking about, I think we have all been thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, And, you know, I think that we tend to see it as a lot of people tend to see it as a very constrained, um, having a constrained focus of police. And, you know, the folks that, who care about these issues, yes, police violence matters a lot, but there's other kinds of violence that this movement and the people who care about this movement, who participate in this movement, also care about. So, for example, not just police violence, but also maybe violence in school curriculum. And actually, I want to tell a story here. So, I have a 6-year-old. His name is Andre, and on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, that he didn't have school that day, and he said, we've been learning about this lady who sat on the bus, and then someone asked her to get off of the bus, get out of her seat, and she said no. And I said, well, I think that you're probably talking about Rosa Parks. That I should like for you to know that that was not the only thing that she did, that she was not the only person that refused to get out of her seat, and that there are more people that you should know. And he said, okay, well, why did she have to get out of her seat in the first place? And that silence is a different kind of violence. But then I had to say, well, I don't. Anyway, so that wasn't part of the curriculum. It was just this kind of happy thing that Rosa Parks didn't get out of her seat, and now look, So the Black Lives Matter movement is concerned with broadening that conversation, even for young people. The violence of segregated neighborhoods, of bad water, of lower access to clean air and water, to the legacy of debt accumulation rather than intergenerational wealth transfers. And so, this movement seeks to highlight, really the kind of specificities that Black women, Black immigrants, undocumented people, formerly incarcerated Black people, poor Black people, differently able to Black people, the challenges that they face, and that they are deserving of attention, and also that they can be leaders in their own communities, that they know what their problems are, and they probably have some solutions that should be heeded. One of the things I should like to notice, I wanted to tell you about is, a long time ago, I met this older Black woman, and we got to talking about the civil rights movement, and she says, not everyone liked Dr. King. And that's, again, not something that we talk about. We all celebrate Dr. King now, and we celebrate the civil rights movement. And so she's like, people, not everyone liked it, including Black people. And so you never hear people say, I didn't march with King. No one ever says that, right? We all talk about it in this celebratory kind of way. But as the Black Lives Matter movement flourished, I was really interested to know, was everyone on board, right? Was everyone on board with the nuances of the movement, and not just the parts that we hear in the media that get put on repeat? And so I start working with my friend Tehema Lopez Bunyazi, who's at George Mason, and we wanted to put a series of questions on a survey to get at this. And what we wanted to know, the questions we wanted to ask were ones like, to what degree is an intersectional politics reflected in the political attitudes of average Black folks? So that idea of intersectionality is central to the Black Lives Matter movement. Do we see that play out among just regular people? And not necessarily that they use that word, but are they focused on the nuances and the specificities? To what extent do we see Black people kind of embracing those who have historically been on the margins of the margins? What is the role of linked fate here? And I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that in a second. And we also hear this business of the politics of respectability. How does that play out here? Is that pushing some people away? What's going on? How can we understand this? So I think these concepts might come up again, especially maybe between Kerry and me too. So I just wanted to explain what I mean by link fate. So link fate is this idea that what happens to people in my group will affect what happens to me or my well-being. Okay? And so this idea in Black politics comes from the history and legacy of being treated as a group member rather than as an individual. Respectability politics. So I don't know if you remember this, but me and you and Lee Baker, when we were talking about Stay Woke, got into a little bit of a debate around the politics of respectability, and I think that I was right. But what I got out of that conversation is to be more nuanced. And I would say that historically, respectability politics was a very specific strategy that Black folks use. Dress well, speak correctly, try to show people that you are not the stereotypes that the negative stereotypes that people have about Black people. But I would argue that there's kind of been an evolution of this idea and a misapplication of the idea in a lot of different ways. And so where before the issue was about kind of collective uplift and responsibility, it's kind of turned into this, you need to behave properly, and if you don't, that's your fault, rather than thinking about greater structural inequalities. And so when I talk about respectability politics, I'm talking about it in that form, in this kind of contemporary logic. And then the third one is secondary marginalization, which is often an outcome of respectability politics, that dominant members of the group might deprioritize or dismiss the needs of folks within the group that they might deem deviant or undeserving of attention of the group. Okay, so what we do is we ask 3,000 people this question. How important is it for Blacks to address the challenges of the following groups? Then we ask them about Black women, we ask them about formerly incarcerated Black people, Black undocumented immigrants, Black gays and lesbians, and Black transgender people. I'm just curious to know if anyone has a hypothesis about how people might respond. So what we see here is that when we ask, 80% of people say Black women's issues are very important, right? And then followed by formerly incarcerated folks, then undocumented, then gays and lesbians, and finally transgender Blacks. Okay, so there's a couple ways that we can interpret this. One is that we can look at one, we have a hierarchy, so we can see it that way. The other way is like maybe we can have some sense of optimism here. If we look at the green bar, that's the one where people say people are not important. Those groups are not important. There's not really that many people in the green bars. On the other hand, if we look at the green bars, we also see that 1 in 4 respondents say that lesbian and gay and transgender people, right, their issues are not important to consider. Okay, so that's kind of a basic look. And so then we're like, we look to see, okay, usually a sense of linked fate brings people together, right? And so we look to see people who have a high sense of linked fate and a low sense of linked fate. And what we see is that people who have a high sense of linked fate who says, what happens to other people in my group will influence my outcomes. We see kind of a bump in caring about different groups. And then we also are curious to know about this respectability business, about what you do, how you behave, is what we should be focused on. And here we see, again, a similar hierarchy, but the people who are low on respectability, who are like, it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter what you look like. It shouldn't matter what you're dressed like. It shouldn't matter if you're in a single family home. That doesn't matter. We see that those people tend to care more, are more likely to say that they think that these groups are very important to consider, to think about. Oh, let me just also say, 30% of people said that all of the groups are very important. Okay, so just FYI. Okay, so it wouldn't be fun if we didn't think about wokeness. And so what we do is we say, all right, there's kind of like a group of folks that are, they're like, yeah, I care about other Black people, but also respectability matters. These kind of your appearance and if you're in the mainstream, if you're not being deviant, right? We might think about that as kind of maybe like the old guy, and we have those folks in yellow. And we would say like you're woke if you're like high sense of linked fate, but low respectability. And we see like kind of big differences between these two groups. Where the smallest differences is I think like 15% for undocumented Black immigrants, that you get like a 15% bump of saying those people are really important. And then I think there's like the biggest difference is 23% over for, I think, what's that? 22% for transgender Blacks, right? That we see a huge difference in how people respond. Okay, but I want you to know that if we consider woke this way, we still have a hierarchy, and we still have plenty of people who say that these groups don't matter, right? So I almost never bring good news. So when we ask, right, do all Black lives matter to Black people? I mean, I guess the answer is no. So, some of the things that come up, right? Some of the questions that come to my mind, and maybe you have other questions that we can answer. So I'm just going to pose these as ones that we can think through together, that we can, chit chat about. What would our world look like if we were kind of very focused on intersectionality? And I mean that in the way of thinking about the specific kind of a recognition of the specific overlap, the effects of overlapping systems of oppression for different groups. And not like in the Women's March way, where you like say you care about intersectionality and then like uninvite Black Lives Matter. Okay. Or, what is our collective responsibility to the most marginalized members of our groups? Are there other things that maybe we didn't consider, right? That people are talking about, and this, I got to thinking about the election, that people are trying to think strategically and about what's practical. Who's the person who's going to beat this candidate? Not who's the person who's going to bring us the most justice, for example. Or another question that comes to mind is, what are some of the structural barriers? Right? Are people thinking about like, well, we have finite resources, so we should only care about these groups and not others? I don't know. And then finally, we tend to think, and history has shown that Black politics has really been a major force to get the United States government policy to do the things that it supposedly says it's going to do, or that it believes itself to be. But ultimately, I guess I would say, one of the reasons that we wrote Stay Woke is because we believe that, most people want to do well, but need guidance towards that. And that's not just white folks, but Black folks too. And so, our goal in the book is to just try to parse through these issues, think through them. How can we be disciplined in understanding the links between, environmental racism, school segregation, healthy, clean air and water, et cetera, that all of these things are linked. What can we do in our day-to-day life, in our day-to-day politics, to improve the the well-being of each of these kinds of groups that Black Lives Matter is interested in thinking about. So I'll stop there and hand it to Kerry.
Great. Thank you, Candis, and again, welcome home. Let me tell one Candis story before I launch into talking about the book and having a conversation. And Candis told a story about showing up in my office, and I encouraged her to do the Ralph Bunche Summer Institute, which is a political science program for undergraduates that we hope will end up sitting where Candis is sitting as a professor of political science. And so it's been a successful program. Professor McLean, Paula McLean, has been the director for 25 plus years of that program. But also, once Candis decided to go to graduate school, I got in trouble with her parents. I don't know if you recall, her mother called me on the phone. And what is this that my daughter's going to do a Ph.D.? We thought she should go to law school, and will you please talk to me about this decision she's made to go to get a Ph.D. So we had a conversation, and I say, look, she'll do well. She's gotten into some very good programs. She comes back to Duke. I don't know if she decided at that point to come back to Duke for a Ph.D. She'll do well, and she'll get a job and do fine. And I remember we had a reception at my house after she got her Ph.D., and your mother remembered that story and spoke to that. And so here Candis sits. So some of you students in the room, when your parents say and they have doubts, tell them to call me and to call us in the room, and we can have that conversation. I want to congratulate Candis and Tehama for writing an excellent book. The book is timely, and I will add timeless, I think. And it's neither hyperbole nor cliche to say that the book deals with life and death issues. So Candis and Tehama have done something that I think more academics should try to do and be conscious about doing. And that is they've written a book on an important topic, and they've used sophisticated and complicated sources and methods to do so. But they've written a book in a way that this underlying research is translatable and accessible, right? That, when I'm working with students and when I write myself, I say my test is often my mother. Mother has a BA degree. She don't know anything about political science other than what, as a field of study. But if I can give her something and she can tell me, what it says, and sort of give me a sense of without knowing the lingo that we use with each other, I met my test. And this is what this book does, so I think it's great in that regard. That there's some sophisticated stuff that Candis showed here that's based on some real sophisticated and complicated research, but it's presented in a way that's translatable and accessible. And I think we, as scholars who chew up a lot of resources, societal resources, even at places like Duke, where we say we're private, we use a lot of resources and we take up a lot of resources. I think we owe something back in terms of being able to say what we do and why it's relevant. So they've done this in this book, so I congratulate them on this. You heard in the introduction that about Candis. Candis is coming home, and that she is a two-time Duke alum, a BA and PhD, and a master's degree in between, or a three-time alum of Duke. But I see Duke in other ways in this book project. For example, this book, I see Eduardo Bonilla Silva all in this book in some of his work. And in fact, this notion of writing things that are translatable and accessible, Eduardo is a master of that, and he's brilliant at that, and many of us should sort of emulate that. So I see that coming in the book. For those of you who don't know, Eduardo's the James B. Duke Professor of Sociology here right across the way. There's some other Duke influences as well. So Candis is at home. In 2010 and 2011, Professor Lopez Bunyasi was the Samuel Du Bois Cook postdoctoral fellow at our Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Gender in the Social Sciences. That was then co-directed by me and Professor McLean, Paula McLean. And Paula also taught Tehama as an undergraduate at UVA. So there's a thread that runs through the book that I recognize from some of the training experiences I know that they had. And one of those for Candis and to Haynie as well, that they're both scholars of race and ethnic politics. And the Race and Ethnic Politics program here at Duke, one of the things that we've done, and we've encouraged students to examine real-world problems and puzzles, for which uncovering new information and new approaches and new thinking might contribute to real solutions. And again, this book reflects that, and I see this book is definitely out of that mode. So I congratulate Candis and to Haynie for doing something that's not easy to do. There's something that's risky to do, and Candis didn't tell you that I was saying, are you sure you want to write this book at this stage in your career? Because it is a risk in the academy to write something that people will read. And that's hard to say, but it's true. But they've done this, and again, and it's as sophisticated as they come, as any study, but it's accessible and translatable. So Candis, talk to me a little bit about the title. What does woke mean? And then why stay woke?
So, I will say, for one, that we wrote this book for our students, and they talk about wokeness. And so we wanted to catch their attention. So when we say stay woke, we mean learn more. We see things that you notice that things just aren't quite right? Can you try to pinpoint what it is? And then once you figure out what it is, try to do something about it. So not just learning and having this information to yourself, which to be quite honest, I think is a thing that the academy incentivizes, is to publish, to learn stuff and then publish in places that most people don't have access to. And so, once you learn more, and then to implement your knowledge. And if it's, writing a letter to your legislator, if it's going to a protest, if it's boycotting, stay woke is doing something about the inequalities that we see
Yeah.
in society.
One of the reasons I asked that question is, there's some intergenerational tensions or even disagreements about wokeness and what woke means. And, old heads like me sometimes will say things like, the younger folk haven't been awake long enough to be woke. Or you might hear some of these folks are so woke they need a nap. And so there's a critique, right? And part of what I'm curious about what you think about those critiques that we hear about wokeness and this tension between the generations around this concept.
Yeah, I was just having a really great conversation with Mark about this, that I think that, even just kind of comparing the civil rights movement to Black Lives Matter, that, people talk about like how well people were dressed and how nicely they behaved and how they resisted in a nonviolent way, and that they didn't take highways and they, didn't, make noise and they weren't angry. And we are misremembering the civil rights movement in many ways. So one is like, Martin Luther King was very angry. People literally did take bridges and highways. And so even just kind of some of the critique is a misreading of the past. Mm-hmm. I do think you're right about how what did you say, that you're so woke you need to take a nap?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah,
okay. I do think that there, what we would refer to as woker than Taoism, right? That you can't learn anything new, that your way is the way. And so one of the things that I think that there are people in the world like that. And so what Tehama and we wanted to address that issue. And one of those ways is just to talk about some of the contestations of the words that we use, our contestation of what the problems actually are in the first place, and to say like, hey, let's try to get on the same page, instead of being, I'm right and you're wrong. I mean, that's a lot of our problems. We usually talk about this issue across the aisle, but sometimes this problem exists among people who should be working, who would normally work together, right? That you have to get on the same page, even with folks who are willing to help you. And I think that, I just thought of this, I think that there's also sometimes this woker than nowism is that if you don't already know, then you don't get to be a part of the group, right? And so instead of lending the hand to say, hey, yeah, maybe you don't know all the terminology and you don't know all of the history, but you want to know, you can come too. And sometimes we see people just say, you don't know, you're racist, go over there. And I find that problematic, because what that does is it constrains the possibilities, right, of who can partake in a particular movement, who can partake in this effort, right, to reduce inequity in this society.
Yeah, and I should say that this tension, this intergenerational tension, has been part of every era of Black politics. Every Black social movement has this tension between the generations, where the older folk don't think the younger folks know enough, or sometimes it's that they haven't paid their dues, and that tension is there, and that's what I think I see in how the Black Lives Movement is perceived and being received in certain circles of Black communities. And I should say, as an educator, one of the frustrations I have, an educator, an old head educator, is that students, folks in the Black Lives Movement, are not students of history, and seemingly shy away from doing what I call your homework, right? And so that you're woke in the present, but may need to be attentive to the past. And so one question is, can one be woke in a meaningful way without being a student of history?
No.
Okay. Good. Because I know that you see it on social media, you see these debates, and the undercurrent is that you're not talking about anything new. I mean, if you just go back and read or pay attention, that you're spinning wheels that, we've already figured out how to get out of that hole. So go back and pay attention and look and think, and I think that's one of the tensions that
Yes. But I think that most people are not students of history, right?
Certainly.
Even older
Yes.
people.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think that we should all be attentive to that. So for example, one of the reasons why Tehama and I, in chapter 3, we kind of write about like what is a radical and what is radical. And now we kind of talk about like incrementalism. Let's move slowly. You don't want to do it too fast. But then if we think about like what Reconstruction was, that was a radical change. I mean, there were people who were formerly enslaved who were in Congress, right? And so even just seeing that history and having, and we tend, right, I didn't learn about Reconstruction before I got to college, right? But even just having an understanding of what is possible, right, is we need to have a broader understanding of history. And I think that's true for all of the generations, right? That we have been in situations where major changes have happened in a relatively short amount of time, and that incrementalism is normal, but radical change is not impossible.
Right, right. And this does come out in the book, just sort of, and I think one of the great things about the book is that you take the time to do the educating piece, right, where there's a glossary. And I like what you all do with it. You put it in the front as opposed to the back, which makes sense, right? You want to know the words before you get to them, right? So they use this as a way of educating and doing some of that historical work. So getting people in the same place, at least as they go through the book, that they start at a similar place. So I think you all do that. But I just know there's a tension out there as to how much people pay attention to the past. And I think you're absolutely right. And that all of us need to pay attention to history. And one of the reasons why things are slow to change, people don't know history, or they know a version of history that may not be that accurate or even right, and sometimes just plain wrong.
Yeah.
And that's on us as educators to attend to that. Let me read, you all you start chapter 1 with a very interesting metaphor, and let me read it, and then I'll ask a question about it. And this is at the very first paragraph of chapter 1, and this is on the matter of Black lives. Let's imagine a street line with high-rise buildings. One of them is burning. What do? All of the buildings matter, but the one on fire matters most at the moment. The thing is, if you don't put out the fire in the burning building, you risk all the surrounding buildings burning down as well. This is the message of the Black Lives Matter movement. Black lives are under attack, and we all ought to galvanize a sense of urgency to address the direct structural and cultural violence that Black people face. It's not only the right thing to do, but the fate of the entire neighborhood depends on it. We as a society cannot say we are all free and equal until those who are at the bottom of various domains of our society, political, economic, social, are also free and equal. So this metaphor of a house on the street in a neighborhood being on fire is an interesting one. I like it, but I've been thinking about it and wrestling with it for the last few days. And for a couple of reasons, I wonder if it's the best metaphor for doing the work of the intersectionality that you all have throughout the book that I think is important. And so one thing I've been thinking about, so given the realities of how we live in a racially segregated society, that our lives are racially segregated in many ways, as you all point out in the book, do non-Blacks see themselves as being in the same neighborhood? They may see my house on fire, but does the metaphor really get them to put themselves in my neighborhood, or they can just say, oh, that's not in my backyard, and so see it, and it allows you to psychologically escape, right? That it's not my neighborhood, so it's easy not to have to wrestle with that. And I also wonder if it works against the intersectionality piece in this way. You know, houses in rows allows one to miss or ignore intersectional realities, or allows one to be strategic and self-serving in putting out fires. So, for example, the fire in the poor Black people house or the previously incarcerated house, I could say it's so hot, so out of control, that we should first attend to other houses that we can save, right? And ignore the full, and keep them from going into full burn and blaze, right? So we go to those first. So I just wondered, right? So I think, well, how would I do this? And I hate this when the book's published for someone to say, is that the right metaphor? But you give talks, so you can always talk about the book. So I'm wondering if framing the problem as all of us living on different floors of the same building, or in different buildings in the same complex might work better. Because it makes it harder for us to get away from thinking about the others, right? If you say my floor in this building is burning, or the gay floor is burning, and you think, well, if that damn floor burns, what does it mean for mine? So just getting, and so the larger question is, right, how do you get people to see these intersectional connections and not escape and think about them in serious ways? Metaphors aside, I mean, that's part of.
You should have asked him that question in advance. I want to say something about this metaphor. So one is that a student of mine, we were just talking. He's like, I'm trying to explain this to my mom, and this is the metaphor that he used. And I thought, I think that's a beautiful metaphor. I'm going to use his name is Brandon Perez. And so that's one thing. Again, just saying that we were writing it with our students in mind, but our students also educate us too.
Yeah. And maybe it works then.
Yeah, so I want to say that about the metaphor, and also just to give Brandon a shout out. And the metaphor actually is in response to the all lives matter business. But I think you're right about how do we think about intersectionality, and how do we get more people to think about the kind of overlapping systems of oppression. That's the best way to put it. And I think one of the things is that we have to keep in mind that the groups are not mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's the way. Because most people are self-centered, and they care about their interests. So even, for example, there are say your name again. Elena. So Elena mentioned that formerly incarcerated Black folks might come to mind first, because that group is primarily, or Black men come to mind. And so, even just thinking about the groups that we laid out, that those groups are not mutually exclusive, right? That there are Black women who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, that there are transgender people who are undocumented immigrants, and so on and so forth. And that's why I said that, I think that we really have to build stamina and discipline in explaining and keeping the interconnections in mind. That's difficult. I think it's difficult, but I think it's something that we have to work toward.
Yeah. I got one more thing. I will move to questions, and so I'll just ask one more of my questions. This has to do with what you all say. I'm on page 168 of those who are following along. And this is comments about leadership, the lack of leadership. It's a comparison of the Black Lives Matter movement to traditional civil rights movement. And a couple things, let me just read. The Black Lives Matter movement is not your grandfather's civil rights movement. So there's that intergenerational dig. There are a number of reasons we make this claim. But one of the main reasons is that the movement's philosophy is rooted in Black feminist ideology. The demands of the Black Lives Matter movement serves as the North Star for anti-racism and racial justice advocates in the 21st century. And here's the second point. The figureheads of the civil rights movement were incredibly important, influential, and effective at moving U.S. society towards its better angels. But the requirements of a single leader implies that average citizens do not understand their own problems or simply do not have the capacity to address them. So that's one point they make, right? So that this lack of recognizable or identifiable leaders in the movement is positioned as a strength, and I'm going to ask about that in a minute. And in another point, good leaders know how to orient their goals and direct their energy. In the United States, most of the inequality we see on a day-to-day basis is not produced by Congress, but instead is created, maintained, and exacerbated in state legislatures and in city halls. You must know your political terrain so you can effectively navigate barriers that stand in between the status quo and racial equality. Those are some interesting points. But the one about leaders and the lack of leaders, does that not pose some difficulty in the movement being effective, and especially in conjunction with the very diffuse interests? As you all mentioned, and you mentioned in your introductory remarks, right? It's not only about police brutality, it's also about inequality, it's also about trans rights, and also about gender equity and those things. And I think all those are important. But without a recognizable core set of leaders and with these diffuse interests, isn't it easy for institutions of government and people in power to dismiss or ignore, or to do what often happens. You don't get to be a black person I should say a black professional at least, of a certain age and not have this happen to you where people cherry pick, right? So they'll go to Mark to avoid me, right? So if you have all these different interests out there, right, there's no recognizable interest, it's easy to go and say, okay, I'm woke. And that's the person I like who represents the Black Lives Matter movement. And I can say that I've aligned myself, and I've been attentive, I've been responsive. But it allows you to ignore other things because because it's so diffuse, you can pick and choose.
I don't think that's a problem. One, I think it's important to keep in mind that we are leaderful. Every community has plenty of leaders or potential leaders. So I think the other thing, when we focus on this kind of big picture national unity, we miss out. I mean, we know, we know that most of the inequality that we see happens at the state legislature, and it happens in city council. And so there are diffuse interests because there are many iterations of inequality that no one solution is going to solve. So for example, in Durham, there's a group of folks who really push to make sure that, you can probably tell us, right, that some number of millions of dollars don't go toward building a bigger police station, but that some of that money, we don't need all that. What we need is some resources over here. That's very specific to Durham. And so a North Carolina answer would not have answered this Durham question. Or right now what's going on with the public housing here?
Right.
That issue is specific to this moment in this time in this town. And so that issue needs to be dealt with. And the people who live there know what the problem is and have ideas about what the solutions are. So I'm not going to be convinced that having just kind of an overarching person that we can point to, they don't have the capacity to understand the myriad of problems, the combinations and permutations of problems that happen in people's everyday lives. The other thing I would say is that even doing this kind of local politics business, we see a national change in conversation. I mean, the candidates are talking about reparations right now. That is not a conversation that we were having 4 years ago, that people have to answer for questions about, they're talking about climate change, and then they're like almost forced to explain how climate change affects Black and brown communities. So, I mean, I think in the aggregate, we are seeing national leaders respond to all of the local and state issues that these different chapters are bringing up.
Yeah, so again, this is a generational difference, but I'll make one comment, then we'll open up for questions, and maybe we'll get to it in the Q&A. Because I would say if you go back to 1984, I picked that year, in 1988, when Jesse Jackson was a candidate for president in this season, right? And so you didn't have talk of a drug czar and a number of things that became, actually we had a cabinet, at one point a cabinet level secretary coming out of Jesse Jackson's national campaign. And, and even the old, a lot of the traditional civil rights movement organizations, they had national organizations and local chapters or local representatives who attended to, so they didn't dictate wrong. I just think that if you look at the US structure, right, it is a federal structure where state and local matter quite a bit. But a lot of resources, Madugal Terrace, right, part of the issue with Madugal Terrace, right, it's not a Durham issue when we've had a federal housing policy that's been a failure. And so we had a federal housing policy in which we relied on federal funds to support to build those and maintain public housing. and then the feds pull out, leaving the states and particularly cities and municipalities will never be in a position to handle that, to hold the bag. So I would, that's one.
What is your here's the thing, is that in this particular moment, we cannot depend on the federal government to do anything on the questions of concern here. And so we have to drill down, right? That we have to turn federalism on its head in this way. So it is historically the case that Southerners are like, right, states' rights. But now we need states to do, right? So California has pissed off the administration by setting admission standards higher, which will force all the other states. And what is the federal government doing? Saying, we don't want you to do that anymore. And so here, if we are in a moment when you can't depend on the national government to change these major issues, to address the issues, why look to them, right? The better strategy is at the local and state government. But you're right, we could go back and forth.
Yeah. No, but so the last thing really, so no, I won't have the last, I'll let Candis have the last word. But it's interesting that we're having this conversation in the Black Lives Matter in this particular context, because one of the most profound changes over the last decade in all of American politics, and what you see on the Republican side, what's happening is not happenstance. They got scared shitless after Obama won in 2008. And they looked at the demographic shifts in the country. Because they had what they called an autopsy to figure out what happened, how did they lose. And they saw that they would continue to lose national elections if they didn't reach out and get black and brown people to vote for Republican candidates. What they've done, instead of doing that, they've done things like voter ID laws, shortening the time you can vote, kicking people off the rolls. So instead of trying to expand their base, they tried to shrink the other side. So we're in a moment now, if you look, even at the state level, there are enough electoral college votes in states where black and brown people can determine their outcomes to dictate who will be the presidential candidate. So there's some numbers there. So I think strategies may be, we have new strategies for a world that doesn't exist anymore, right? As opposed to looking at the world that exists and thinking about strategies and organizing a movement around the world as it exists today, not as it did before, if that makes sense.